Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Las Perlitas wash processed Colombia from Banibeans. And there's the bag right there. And Banibeans, based out of Ljubljana, Slovenia. And they're a coffee roaster we did an entire series on earlier this year, as they're a coffee roaster that came highly suggested to us. And while we did have some mixed feedback on the coffees we reviewed, I did find a bright spot in the Luis Anibal, a honey processed Colombian coffee. So I knew at some point we'd go back and revisit Banibeans. And that's why I was pretty excited to find out that Airworks was going to be bringing this coffee in, as not only did I want to revisit Banibeans, but this coffee also sounded interesting given that it is a Chiroso coffee. And we've had some pretty mixed experiences with Chiroso coffees as well. So I figured I'd give this one a shot, and we'll see how it's turned out, as this right here is day 41. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. It is kind of interesting. This coffee did feel a slight bit more developed than what I'd remembered from the coffee review series we'd had of Banibeans earlier this year. And it was always kind of interesting to me that Banibeans does take inspiration from coffee roasters like Dock and Kawa, which at times have a little bit different of a profile than sometimes I'm expecting from them, which is to say that this coffee is actually reminiscent of some of these slightly more developed coffees I've had from Kawa in the past, which isn't necessarily on the overly light side of things. I feel like the best way to kind of define this one is maybe being on the lighter side of the light medium in terms of that roast profile. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and we opted for the V60, and the cup had a notably strong sweetness as it skewed a lot more on the brown candy and caramel side of things than initially expected, especially given that there wasn't any sort of note on here indicating that that might be the case with it. In addition to that, there was a slight bit more development than previously experienced from the coffees we had had from them in the past, but it was made up for by an abundance of sweetness, and truth be told, that first impression was about as far from the notes that they had listed on here as I could have expected, as it really just seemed to skew so much in that brown candy caramel direction. And it is kind of interesting to me. I don't think I remembered what Banibeans was using as their roaster the first time around, but I believe that as of right now, at least with this coffee, they were using a drum roaster, which is kind of interesting to me. I've heard that in the future they might switch over and might go a little lighter with their profile. But for right now, that was the first experience I'd had, which once again was a lot more counter to what I was expecting from this coffee. Day 18 through the Chemex, and this one was a little bit more in line with the listed notes, as it was now offering a little bit more of the citric aspects with still plenty of that caramelized sweetness as well. A slight soda-like feel to it between the citric components as well as that spiced quality, so it's been pretty interesting as of this moment. We move on to day 21 as we opted for the April brewer, and the cup has been pretty consistent as of this moment, as now it's offering a slight spice-like soda feel with a combination of the spiced herbality to it as well as those citric tones. In addition to that, there's a notable candied sweetness once again, which is kind of counter to the expectations for this coffee. Plenty of the Chiroso-like tropicality as well yet again. So it's been, I would say, as of this moment, the first experience was unique, and then since then I've seen it kind of transition to still offering that base of that coffee to having a little bit more of these citric tones to it. Day 24 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, and it has helped a little bit with these slightly developed qualities, as the cup has skewed a little bit more on the listed citric attributes, a little bit less of the caramelized components with a much more prominent orange zesty tone, which was kind of interesting in itself. This coffee had maybe a little bit more depth than what the initial impression would have indicated. Day 27 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and this one is a bit more in line with the listed notes, as there's a slight bitterness to citric qualities in line with the listed orange peel, and I see a lot of those zesty citric qualities within this one, as once again it had a little bit of a bitterness to it, but I also think that that's the direction this coffee was supposed to go. Plenty of the citric zest with the rest of the cup still offering a fair bit of sweetness and a lingering spiced tone, so it's pretty much in line with the notes with the addition of that very strong candy component that I was experiencing. Day 30 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it does continue to skew more on the spiced citric side of things with the earlier caramelized sweetness also still present, but in a little less pronounced of a sense. There's a slight bit more definition to the citric tones, as they seem to be improving as well, and it's as of this moment I'm thinking that this coffee is just ever so slightly improving every time we brew it. as on day 33 we opted for the Chemex with our standard recipe, and it is interestingly more reminiscent of the first impression with that very strong caramelized candied sweetness. And I feel like that's why I went back to the Chemex, because for whatever reason it seemed to be a little bit more accentuated through this brew method on the later days, as opposed to some of the earlier days when it was a little bit more prominent in the V60. It is still encompassed by a zesty citric quality in line with the listed orange peel, but it still feels like it's slowly settling and improving in general. Day 36, final notes we have through the V60 with our standard recipe, and once again it does feel like it's improving incrementally every single time I'm brewing it, every single day that passes, as it's reminiscent of the earlier sweeter experiences, especially within the finish. As it cools, there is a really wide array of spiced qualities, including more of that zesty citric feel, once again giving it that slightly more soda-like theme and tone to this one. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. There's actually a lot in this tasting wheel, so let's go through it. We have a lot of level 4s, and we'll start with the body level 4. That is so interesting to me. I remember making this tasting wheel, especially after making it, after making a couple of other tasting wheels at the same time. This one just had so much body relative to those other coffees, one of which was the Rumu Damo from Terraform, but even then this coffee right here just had notably more texture to it, and for that reason it scored very high at the level 4 mark. Very interesting to me in that sense. Cleanliness, level 4, and yes, it is marred ever so slightly by the slight smoky quality, but outside of that, I wouldn't say that there's anything that can really take away from the overall experience in terms of the cleanliness on this one. A lot of the components are pretty well defined, at least above average in terms of definition. There isn't any sort of funkiness or fermentiness that can really take away from it either, so I'm happy with it being there at that level 4 in terms of that cleanliness. Finish, level 4. And the finish, I would say, maybe not necessarily my favorite part. It does have that lingering spiced tone to it, and I have kind of mixed impressions of that, as it's not necessarily my favorite thing. Truth be told, as I'm drinking this coffee today, it just doesn't seem to have the same sort of zesty citric finish that maybe some of the earlier experiences I'd had of this coffee indicated. However, this coffee is ever changing. Just above room temperature, I was experiencing more of those zesty qualities. Here's it's about room temperature. It's not quite as prominent in presence, so it just changes quite a bit. Sweetness, level 4, and I'm not entirely sure if this was ever meant to be an overly sweet coffee, but it turned out that way for me, because for whatever reason I continuously kept getting more and more of those brand county notes, and they just kept coming, especially on the later days with the Chemex. So interesting to me, a lot of sweetness within this coffee. Acidity, level 4. And I remember thinking when making this tasting wheel as well, whether or not I could justify it being as high as it was. But given that there was just so much citric zest within this one and came out in a little bit more brighter of a sense within the cup itself, I said level 4 works for me. Florality, level 4. And I was also going back and forth on the floral components within this one, but I said to myself, it's a more spiced herbal floral tone that's also present within this one. So as long as I accompany it with the spice being there at that level 4, which it is, it's very high in that sense, then I could justify both those things being pretty high, as I would say that's probably the most predominant factor within this coffee outside of maybe the citric zest. But you get 3 really strong and pronounced defined profiles within this one, with that being one of them. So happy with both those there at that level 4. Citrus fruit, level 4. If I recall correctly, I think that they have multiple citric notes on here. I think maybe even one of them is just citrus. But yes, there's a strong bitter citric quality that's much more reminiscent of citric zest. I don't think the sweetness even necessarily comes from the fruit profiles within this one or the floral profiles. It just comes from that really, we'll say, more robust caramelized component, which is the next thing we're discussing, being there at that level 4. Once again, interesting to me that there's no mention or indication of that anywhere within this coffee, but it's very strong, prominent, and pronounced within it for me, especially from that first try. And truth be told, from that first try, there was very little else I was experiencing from it. And here on this day, while it may not necessarily be overly prominent within the finish, it still was on the earlier stages of brewing this coffee. So it's a very strong and pronounced profile for me. We move on to a couple of level 3s. We will start with the stone fruit level 3, and it does have that chirroso-like, we'll say, mango component to it. It has that tropicality, that chirroso tropicality to it. And I even toyed around with maybe pushing the berry fruit up to level 3, because I could see a little bit more of those tropical berry components also present within this one. And in hindsight, I probably could and should push that up to a level 3, but nonetheless, plenty of that chirroso-like tropicality to it. Bitterness, level 3. That shouldn't come as a surprise given just the strong, zesty, citric qualities that are present within this one. Savoriness, level 3. And that's another one that was kind of interesting to me. I said, we're just getting so many kind of more savory spice tones within this one. So level 3 seemed like a pretty good place to put that one. And then last thing worth discussing, it's interesting there are no level 1s on here, but last thing worth discussing is the smokiness at a level 2. I don't necessarily think it was overly pronounced or it hindered the coffee too much. It was just there lingering in the background enough to a point where I needed to notate that and mark it, especially given that I wasn't really expecting that from this coffee. But given that there were enough other things to kind of make up for it, it interestingly ended up being one of the lower things on this tasting wheel, on a tasting wheel that has some pretty high marks. So that's to say, not the most noticeable or pronounced thing within it, but still present within it. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I can't quite tell whether or not this is in line with the previous experiences I had had from Banibeans, mostly because this one was a fair bit different from what I remember from those coffees. So it turned out nice, but it sounded like an interesting coffee right from the onset. And I did have a discussion with Jacob as to whether or not I was going to purchase this coffee, and I continuously thought to myself whether or not I should, but given that I needed to revisit Banibeans and try them one more time, I figured this would be a good opportunity to do so. And it honestly just left me a little bit more stumped than it had going into it, because I thought I had a pretty good idea and impression of this coffee roaster, but then this one seemed to kind of change that impression overall, as I'm like, is it those first experiences that I remember that's more Banibeans, or is it this one that's a little bit more what the coffee roaster is going for? But given that I think that the profile is going to be changing from this point going forward, it's actually neither of them. Nonetheless, this coffee was interesting. It seemed to offer a lot of changing characteristics to it, and for that reason, I would say it just made it a little bit more fun of a review, mostly because it wasn't as straightforward as some other coffees we've reviewed in the past. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I feel like if you really like your spiced citric tones, then this one's a really good fit for you. It offered tremendous sweetness for me, and I'm very curious as to whether or not a lot of people experience that same level of sweetness that I had, because for me, it was just really high. And for that reason, it offered something a little bit more unique in that sense. And I don't know if everybody also experienced that same level of sweetness, but if they did, then I also want to point at that sweetness because it was very high and an ever-present quality within this one for me. So those are the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Las Perlitas wash processed Colombia from Banibeans. Thank you for watching.